The Vietnam War, spanning from 1955 to 1975, brutally split the nation into two distinct regions. The North, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, embraced communism, receiving substantial backing from the Soviet Union and China. Conversely, the South, led by Ngo Dinh Diem, was propped up by the U.S., advocating an anti-communist regime. The 1954 Geneva Accords officially partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel, promising future elections for unification. However, these elections never materialized, escalating tensions between the two regions and ultimately igniting armed conflict. It was amidst this growing instability that the U.S. began its intervention, driven by the fear of a domino effect that would spread communism across Southeast Asia. By 1961, the U.S. had started sending military advisors and supplying weapons to the South in its fight against the Viet Cong, a southern guerrilla force backed by the North, which steadily expanded its resistance efforts. Simultaneously, Ngo Dinh Diem's crackdown on Buddhists sparked severe political instability, progressively alienating the populace. In 1963, the haunting images of monk Thich Quang Duc's self-immolation sent shockwaves across the globe. The 1963 Battle of Ia Drang vividly demonstrated the Viet Cong's effectiveness, as only 350 guerrillas managed to defeat 1,500 South Vietnamese troops. Leveraging effective tactics like spike traps and ambushes, the Viet Cong inflicted heavy losses. 80 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed, and hundreds more were wounded in the Battle of Ia Drang alone. Alarmed by the South's imminent collapse, the U.S. significantly escalated its military aid and advisors to thousands. Ia Drang profoundly shocked U.S. public opinion, sparking serious doubts about the South's capacity to secure victory, thus compelling deeper American military intervention. Later in 1963, widespread discontent with Diem culminated in a U.S.-backed coup. Diem was overthrown, and this pivotal event paved the way for direct U.S. military intervention. The 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident served as the official pretext for the U.S. to drastically escalate its involvement in the war. Subsequently, the U.S. Congress swiftly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing large-scale troop deployments and expanding military operations. Then, in March 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines landed in Da Nang. This not only marked the direct intervention of American forces on a large scale, but also officially launched a full-blown war. Also, in 1965, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, an intense bombing campaign over North Vietnam, intending to sever its supply lines. Over 643,000 tons of bombs were dropped. Yet despite the massive scale of the campaign, North Vietnam steadfastly sustained its resistance. Furthermore, the U.S. employed Agent Orange, which not only devastated forests and crops, but also inflicted horrific, long-lasting consequences for generations. The 1965 Battle of Ia Drang marked the first large-scale clash between U.S. forces and the Liberation Army, with 1,000 American soldiers confronting 2,000 North Vietnamese troops. Ia Drang starkly revealed the war's sheer brutality, with approximately 300 U.S. soldiers and 1,000 North Vietnamese troops killed. Despite the U.S. utilizing helicopters for rapid mobility, their losses continued to mount. Meanwhile, North Vietnam effectively employed hit-and-run tactics, deliberately avoiding direct confrontations with superior American forces. The U.S. intensified its airstrikes, yet failed to halt the relentless flow of supplies through the intricate Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Viet Cong's extensive tunnel systems and bunkers remarkably allowed them to survive the relentless U.S. bombardment. The war of attrition dragged on, taking a grim toll on U.S. forces, with an average of 500 American soldiers killed weekly by 1967. The U.S. implemented search and destroy tactics, intended to root out the Viet Cong, yet these operations frequently resulted in significant civilian casualties. As both casualties and the financial cost of the war soared, U.S. public opinion increasingly began to question its legitimacy and winnability. Operation Rolling Thunder persisted until 1968, relentlessly bombing. Yet, despite the immense pressure, it ultimately failed to break the North's resolve, which stood firm with 300,000 troops and militia. Although the U.S. escalated its troop presence to 500,000 by 1967, the elusive Viet Cong guerrilla tactics effectively exhausted American forces in the dense jungles and harsh swamps. The protracted war of attrition took a devastating toll on the U.S. Thousands of troops died, while the Viet Cong impressively maintained a formidable strength of approximately 50,000 fighters. The U.S. search and destroy tactic aimed to eliminate the Viet Cong, but the challenging terrain and the enemy's adept guerrilla tactics rendered this objective nearly impossible. The escalating brutality and protracted nature of the war gradually eroded U.S. morale, while the North steadfastly continued to funnel weapons and supplies via the resilient Ho Chi Minh Trail. In January 1968, during the Tet Offensive, the People's Liberation Army launched a massive surprise attack on over 100 cities across South Vietnam, deploying a force of 80,000 troops. Saigon itself reeled as the Viet Cong audaciously attacked the U.S. Embassy, shocking the world with the sheer boldness and unprecedented scale of their tactics. The ferocious Battle of Hue raged for months, with 10,000 North Vietnamese troops fiercely battling U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, incurring devastating losses on both sides. Iconic images like Napalm Girl and Saigon Execution rapidly spread globally, profoundly shocking the world's conscience. The Tet Offensive exacted a horrific toll on all sides. Approximately 14,000 civilians, 4,000 U.S. troops, and 20,000 liberation forces were killed. Although considered a military failure, Tet successfully shattered deep-seated U.S. confidence, thereby igniting a massive and unprecedented anti-war movement across America. Before the Tet Offensive, the Battle of Ia Drang unfolded with 6,000 U.S. troops. Troops besieged by 20,000 North Vietnamese in a protracted engagement, foreshadowing the brutal escalation of the war. Despite massive U.S. artillery and airstrike support to defend Ia Drang, the heavy losses only intensified doubts about their eventual victory. Tet fundamentally altered U.S. public perception of the war, consequently mounting immense pressure on the Johnson administration to withdraw troops. The U.S. anti-war movement exploded with unprecedented force, as tens of thousands protested vehemently, demanding an immediate end to the Vietnam War. Tet profoundly marked a historical turning point, compelling the U.S. to concede that a military victory in Vietnam was definitively unattainable. Consequently, the U.S. initiated troop reductions, transitioning to the Vietnamization strategy, aiming to transfer the war's full responsibility and burden to the South Vietnamese Army. In 1969, President Nixon announced troop withdrawals, yet in reality, the war persisted with substantial U.S. air support. In 1971, Operation Lam Son 719 was launched, aiming to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail as 20,000 South Vietnamese troops advanced into Laotian territory. However, Lam Son 719 ended in a disastrous failure, with 8,000 South Vietnamese troops killed or heavily wounded, largely due to the sophisticated ambush tactics of the North Vietnamese Army. Despite vigorous U.S. airstrike support for Lam Son 719, they were ultimately unable to prevent North Vietnam from maintaining control and transport along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operation Linebacker in 1972 involved intense bombing campaigns on Hanoi and Haiphong, inflicting substantial damage. Nevertheless, it failed to force North Vietnam into submission. Over 200,000 tons of bombs were deployed in Linebacker, largely devastating North Vietnam's infrastructure. Yet the Vietnamese populace remained remarkably resilient, tirelessly rebuilding their nation and refusing to yield. Ultimately, the 1973 Paris Peace Accords compelled the U.S. to withdraw all its troops, having suffered approximately 58,000 American soldiers killed throughout the war. Even after the U.S. withdrawal, the brutal conflict between the two Vietnams relentlessly continued, fueled by unwavering North Vietnamese support. In 1975, the historic Ho Chi Minh Campaign commenced, with a formidable force of 270,000 North Vietnamese troops simultaneously advancing on Saigon, determined to unify the country. With overwhelming force, the liberation forces rapidly shattered South Vietnamese defenses, entering Saigon on April 30, 1975. On that same day, April 30, 1975, liberation tanks rolled into the Presidential Palace, now Independence Palace, signifying the complete collapse of South Vietnam. The unified Vietnamese flag proudly flew over the Presidential Palace, officially marking the grand reunification of the country after more than 2 decades of divisive warfare. The war finally concluded at an unimaginable cost. Over 3 million Vietnamese lives and 58,000 U.S. soldiers were lost. The war left Vietnam utterly devastated, with millions of hectares of land contaminated by Agent Orange, severely impacting the health of its people for generations. Over 2 million Vietnamese civilians have suffered and continue to suffer from horrific birth defects due to Agent Orange exposure, a painful and enduring legacy of the war. Not only Vietnamese civilians, but also U.S. veterans have likewise endured severe consequences from Agent Orange. With tens of thousands afflicted by serious illnesses in the aftermath of the war. Beyond the physical devastation, the war inflicted profound emotional scars, leaving millions of Vietnamese displaced, bereaved, and stripped of their peaceful lives. U.S. veterans, upon returning home, were often met with indifference and a lack of understanding from society, with many grappling with severe post-traumatic stress disorder in the war's aftermath. In the aftermath of the war, Vietnam embarked on a monumental task of national reconstruction, with millions of its people uniting to rebuild the nation from its ashes and ruins. Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City gradually emerged as vibrant economic hubs, serving as clear symbols of Vietnam's remarkable rebirth and resurgence. With unwavering resilience, the Vietnamese people tirelessly worked to improve their lives, striving to build a peaceful and prosperous future. In 1995, Vietnam and the U.S. officially normalized diplomatic relations, thereby opening a promising new chapter in the history of cooperation between the two nations. Many U.S. veterans returned to Vietnam, not only to confront their past, but also to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. International organizations actively participated in aiding Vietnam's post-war recovery efforts, ranging from clearing unexploded ordnance to providing essential healthcare for victims. The majestic Trong Son National Martyrs Cemetery stands as a sacred memorial to tens of thousands of Vietnamese martyrs, a profound symbol of their ultimate sacrifice for independence and freedom. Vietnam consistently holds solemn memorials, perpetually honoring and remembering the valiant individuals who sacrificed for the nation's independence. Today, the U.S. and Vietnam have intensified their collaboration in areas like education and trade, actively building robust bridges from a deeply painful past. Visits by U.S. leaders to Vietnam have significantly solidified the growing strategic partnership between the two nations. Vietnam has emerged as a top tourist destination, drawing millions of international visitors eager to explore its rich culture and profound history. Numerous environmental projects in Vietnam are actively underway, dedicated to restoring the forests severely devastated by the war. Peace education is actively promoted, aiming to instill in younger generations the profound values of unity and reconciliation. Vietnam and the U.S. continue to collaborate in addressing unresolved war-related issues, from recovering the remains of missing personnel to providing support for war victims. The Vietnam War provided humanity with a profound lesson on the devastating cost of conflict and, simultaneously, on the immense power of forgiveness, reconciliation, and rebuilding. The U.S. failure in Vietnam stemmed from a confluence of complex factors, ranging from flawed military tactics to the enemy's unyielding and resilient resolve. The U.S. over-relied on its superior firepower, yet this tactic proved largely ineffective within Vietnam's dense jungles and complex terrain. Conversely, the elusive Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics, particularly their surprise ambushes, consistently wore down U.S. forces. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained an unyielding vital supply line, defying relentless U.S. bombing, with over 20,000 workers continuously transporting goods and war materials day and night. Vietnam's unyielding resolve and fervent determination to unify the country proved to be a pivotal factor, with millions willingly joining the protracted resistance. The U.S. also suffered from a profound lack of understanding regarding Vietnam's culture and challenging terrain, which led to numerous critical strategic missteps. The U.S. search and destroy tactic, though targeting the enemy, inflicted heavy civilian casualties, thereby alienating crucial South Vietnamese popular support. The powerful anti-war movement that surged within the U.S. significantly weakened the government's resolve to continue the conflict. U.S. media's continuous and candid coverage of wartime losses and violence profoundly eroded public confidence in the government. The South Vietnamese government remained inherently unstable, plagued by widespread corruption and severe internal divisions, which significantly weakened its alliance with the U.S. The U.S. gravely underestimated and failed to anticipate the North's extraordinary persistence and resilience, sustained by a formidable force of 300,000 troops and militia. The war's immense cost, estimated at over $160 billion, placed an immense financial burden that significantly strained the U.S. economy. The U.S. lacked a clear and consistent strategic objective, which generated widespread confusion and a lack of direction throughout its campaigns. The 1968 Tet Offensive proved to be a definitive turning point, unequivocally shattering U.S. confidence in its ability to achieve victory. The unwavering support from the Soviet Union and China for the North, encompassing modern weapons and training for its 300,000 troops, was another crucial factor. The U.S. failed to garner broad international support, consequently isolating its military campaign. U.S. troop morale also steadily eroded, as 500,000 soldiers grappled with extreme stress, widespread discontent, and the lack of clear purpose. Vietnamization ultimately failed, as South Vietnamese forces proved incapable of standing independently against the North's growing military might. The signing of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords compelled a complete U.S. withdrawal, leaving South Vietnam to face the overwhelming strength of the North Vietnamese Army alone. In summary, the U.S. lost the Vietnam War because it could not overcome the unbreakable will of the Vietnamese people, and simultaneously, due to its own inherent strategic miscalculations.